We'll begin our discussion of Angelica Kauffmann with a comparison of her Sorrow of Telemachus from 1783 with a portrait by her contemporary Sir Joshua Reynolds from 1780, which you're familiar with by now. So let's just set out the basics about the similarities and differences between these paintings. Kauffmann's painting, first of all, is a multi-figure painting, right? It's not in the genre of portraiture, as we've seen so often with Reynolds and Gainsborough in previous meetings, but instead, this is a multi-figure composition, what we'll discuss as a history painting. We see people with similarities in costume and accessories to Lady Talbot in Kauffmann's The Sorrow of Telemachus. But this ancient theme, and we remember the signaling of classical costumes and virtues in Reynolds' painting, is not in Kauffmann's hands tied to the contemporary world. So these aren't contemporary figures in the costume of antiquity, but instead we're looking at a scene from the classical world. Kauffmann is using more gesture and emotion to signal to us the construction of a narrative. There's a story we read here, partially through the bodies, the gestures of the figures. And few painters of either gender could have been more commercially successful than Kauffmann was in her own moment. Her classical compositions and portraits, which you'll also see, were sought out by the English aristocracy and can be found in many major collections around the world. She was collected by King George III and other members of the royal family, for instance. As you read in your article by Vickery, she was enormously popular, right? She had a huge funeral orchestrated by the very famous neoclassical sculptor Canova. She produced an estimated 1,500 paintings, history paintings, portraits, decorative designs, and really made a fortune during her lifetime. Her work was engraved and reproduced in every conceivable medium, and I'm not just talking about prints here, but you could see her paintings reproduced on fans and furniture, her designs on flower vases and snuff boxes, wine coolers, tea sets, porcelain groups, ceiling and interior decorations. And that's why we can connect Kauffmann to this idea of branding and sort of commercial as well as artistic savviness. This composition, which of course started as a painting, Cleopatra adorning the tomb of Mark Antony from 1772, you're seeing a mezzotint here. And this painting was so popular, there were 2 rounds of engraving. So we can see the kind of material records for the demands for her work. And again, this image was reproduced in such varied media as a watch case and a tea wagon, so very popular stuff. Another indication of Kauffmann's popularity was the patronage of the industrialist Matthew Boulton, who developed a secret method for the mechanical reproductions of pictures at his Soho firm around 1780. So this is a transfer process. Remember, this is the days before, long before, photographic reproduction of images. So seeing compositions, seeing reproductions of artworks was extremely hard, especially on a mass scale. But Boulton's transfer process was a variation of aquatint engraving and was an effort to mass produce Kauffmann's neoclassical compositions as ceiling decorations for the market. And this would have been very fashionable for the kind of architectural decoration of the day. So Kauffmann executed nearly 30 pictures for his project to mass produce designs for these ceilings. And during her 15 years in England, spanning 1766 to 1781, she earned £14,000. This was no small sum at that period, especially for a female artist, right? This is the 18th century after all. So Kauffmann's career attests to this vast market for neoclassicism as a style, right? The interest in the classical world and classical style and form that we saw emerge as a result of the Grand Tour and archaeological excavations that we've discussed in this class. And her career also attests to her real savviness with branding and her ability to anticipate and meet the demands of this elite clientele. I'm setting a self-portrait by Angelica Kauffmann next to two self-portraits you've already seen in this class, right? William Hogarth's from 1745 and Joshua Reynolds from 1780. So what do we notice about Kauffmann's self-presentation, especially in contrast to these other two male artists? You remember that Hogarth's portrait demonstrates his erudition, right? His connection to the literary tradition in England, which was also a kind of nationalistic pull. His connection to English literary tradition, and realism, right? We remember that serpentine line on the artist's palette and the realistic flaws in his face and his pug's face that he allows here. So his artistic theories, his national identity, his literary connections, they're all on display. Sir Joshua Reynolds, this really striking, quite a beautiful portrait that you've seen, really puts on display the artist's association with classicism, right? He shows himself in fine clothing. He's demonstrating that art, the fine arts, painting, sculpture, have this elite status. This was not always true in the history of art, but this was something that Renaissance artists really helped to elevate, and the revival of classicism and Renaissance themes, motifs, ideas helped to add to this sort of elite status for art. He's also associating himself with Michelangelo here through that portrait, right? Drawing that arm across to a marble statue of Michelangelo. Angelica Kauffmann doesn't present herself with so many attributes, right? She holds a portfolio, a kind of sketchbook, and a porte crayon. This is an implement that one would hold that contains charcoal at the end, so you wouldn't get your hands sooty. This is kind of like a cigarette holder for your charcoal crayon. And she wears a kind of imaginary, a classical garment, which refers to her place in a lineage of artists, right? This classical tradition and her stylistic commitments to classicism that she shares in part with Reynolds. But this is interesting. This is not an example of the kind of vogue for Grecian dress that took place in the 1780s throughout Europe. This is a kind of imaginary classicized costume. There are art historians that do lots of work tracking the fashion history in many of the paintings you see. But this is imaginary. So she's distancing herself from society and from the kind of rapidly changing mores of fashion, and depicts herself with the tools of her trade, right? She makes a claims for her principal identity as being an artist, right, rather than being a woman who cares about fashion or exists in this kind of contemporary space. She's linking herself to longer traditions here and to her work, right? Which even Reynolds, who shows himself identifying with a very famous artist, he's not showing himself at work, but Kauffmann feels she needs to. And this is in part because of her gender. It's not something that Reynolds or Hogarth even had to worry about, right? Demonstrating their identity as an artist, or their work as an artist. And like the 18th century French artist Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who you may be familiar with, you may not be, that's okay. Kauffmann was the daughter of a painter, Johann Kauffmann, and she was Swiss-born. So this is often the case with women in the early histories of art, where not many women are allowed to show up. This is not a career path available without this kind of cultivation at home. So Johann, ambitious and eager to improve his circumstances, moved from the small town of Schwarzenberg in Switzerland to the town of Chur. Chur was a key center on the Rhine route to the Alps. It was a very prosperous town. And there, Johann managed to secure several church commissions and do portraits of prominent citizens. Now, Switzerland at this moment was already becoming the neutral land where industries flourished, right? They had this kind of political neutrality and favored, business and commercial enterprise over political affiliations. And its relative religious tolerance induced distinguished writers and scientists, including Rousseau, Voltaire, Lavater, to make their homes there. So we'll just focus in on this portrait while we discuss her background a little bit more. So Angelica was born in Chur in 1741. She was the only child of Johann's two marriages, and so her father really centered his interests and ambitions on her. He was a strict master, and she received lots of attention and became a kind of practicing professional at the age of 11, if you can imagine that. So Johann was hoping to exploit his daughter's talents for profit, and he looked to more urban prospects and took her first to Como in Italy, then Milan, and then to Rome in 1763. And remember, these were big tourist centers in the mid-18th century. In Italy, they were introduced to J.J. Winkelmann, who really helped establish the key theories for the neoclassical movement. He studied the art of the ancient Greeks and Romans, wrote treatises, and so was a big advocate for neoclassicism, and advocated for the imitation of classical art as the kind of most ideal art. Winkelmann was interested in the depiction of male beauty rather than female beauty. He thought that was the kind of ideal state or value for these ancient civilizations. And by reviving the art of the past, these advocates for neoclassicism thought that they could also bring back the past values as well. Values like representative government, that will be important in the French context, cultural primacy, so establishing through art centers for cultural production. And Winkelmann commissioned her to do the following portrait, an important document the year he wrote his very famous History of Ancient Art. So here's Kauffmann's portrait of Winkelmann, this important thinker. And she presents him at work, right? Just like she framed her own self-portrait. Here he is inventorying ancient sculpture, if one were to read the text in the book in front of him. And his collar is unbuttoned, and he wears coarse clothes, right? he's comfortable. He's at work. These are not Van Dyck silks, right? Or sort of posing in front of classicizing columns. So she's framing Winkelmann, the theoretician, as a worker, not a kind of refined aesthete or a dilettantish scholar. Now, as both a woman and a breadwinner, Angelica Kauffmann was very class conscious. So the decisions she makes about clothes and accessories and signals of class, they're very carefully done. And here she paints quite a dignified image of Winkelmann, who came from humble backgrounds. He was a cobbler's son and really rose through his intellectual labor here. And Winkelmann was very proud of this portrait. This was an important document for him at this key year of his career. This is one of a pair of paintings made by Angelica Kauffmann shortly after she settled in Rome in 1782. Here you see the Sorrow of Telemachus, right, from 1783, painted for Monsignor Onorato Ceatani, and this was one of two scenes from the life of Telemachus. So this is a figure from the ancient world, the son of Odysseus, and this was based on the novel The Adventures of Telemachus, which was published by the influential French theologian and political theorist François Fénelon in 1699, something that was very popular throughout Europe during the 18th century. So often when we see these stylistic trends, these stylistic movements in the visual arts, they're often tethered quite closely to trends and developments in literature. This is true in neoclassicism too. So these classical tales were popular in novel form. So in the first painting, which you're not seeing, Telemachus, guided by Athena in the guise of mentor, was shipwrecked off Calypso's island while searching for his father. In the first scene, again, which you're not seeing, Calypso's nymphs gather around Telemachus, offering him fruit and wine and flowers. In the second painting, which you're seeing here, Calypso silences the nymphs there at left, who have been singing Odysseus's praises when she sees the sadness of his son. So a woman, this woman in white, Calypso, at the center of the painting, is directing the action. So there's not this total or overwhelming adherence to this neoclassical emphasis on the nude male body as the primary, the most important vehicle for meaning and action and patriotism and beauty, as figures like Winkelmann thought. Angelica Kauffmann soon attached herself to the English community in Italy and became a kind of instant hit among the grand tourists that we've talked about before. She was very gifted linguistically, speaking fluent English, and received her most profitable commissions from British visitors to Rome and Naples and Venice. Remember, this was all part of the craze for everything ancient, everything Italian, following the discovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum in the 18th century. Winkelmann noted in a letter to a friend that Kauffmann, quote, paints all the English who visit Rome. And their orders for portraits and classical subjects encouraged her to move to England after Italy to set up shop. On a trip to Venice in 1765, she met the wife of His Majesty's resident, John Murray, who styled herself Lady Wentworth. And Lady Wentworth had high cultural aspirations and liked being a patron to talented individuals. She was the one who sponsored Angelica Kauffmann's trip to London in 1766. So through Lady Wentworth, this woman patron, the woman artist Angelica Kauffmann met members of the nobility and the neoclassical movement in Britain, so the kind of cultural movers and shakers who are interested in the same stylistic stuff that she was. English buyers at this time sought what they called classicalities. So again, the neoclassical style. And during her first year in England, she received visits from lots of notable people: Lord Baltimore, the Princess of Wales, Princess Augusta of Brunswick. This is the king's sister. And she was introduced to Queen Charlotte, who became her close friend. So women patrons are going to be quite an important story in her career. In 1768, she was elected as one of the founding members of the Royal Academy, which we discussed in the context of Sir Joshua Reynolds. And so this was really an astounding coup, not only for a woman, but she was only 27 at the time. And quite shockingly, until 1936, only one other woman, Mary Moser, had been elected as a full member since Angelica. So this is a man's world through the 20th century. At the first exhibition of the new Royal Academy in 1769, Kauffmann exhibited 4 pictures, all based on narratives from Homer or Virgil, these stories of ancient heroism. Many members of the aristocracy had just returned from the 7 Years' War. Think about all the military uniforms we've seen in portraiture of Reynolds and Gainsborough. And these folks looked upon the Trojan War from ancient stories as the kind of antique counterpart to the 7 Years' War, and identified with the heroes of the Iliad and Odyssey, going abroad and fighting and coming back. All of these are very graciously posed, right, without kind of intense drama or hyperbolic emotional attention, but they're quite moving and very clearly from the perspective of a woman branding herself as a woman painter. So on the left, you see the last interview of Hector and Andromache, one of the most dramatic scenes in these stories, turned into a tale of wifely and maternal solitude. Hector is shown here not a kind of stalwart hero, but here he's a wistful juvenile who wears his helmet uneasily. There's an emphasis on Andromache's tender gesture, as well as this kind of moving moment between the nurse and the child who she cradles in her arms. So this is not a scene of masculine courage, right? Hector going off to war. But instead refocuses the scene to one of domestic concerns, which Hector really repudiates. So too with the painting in the center, Andromache and Hecuba weeping, which was exhibited in 1772. This isn't a scene of male sacrifice that one would expect from tales of the Odyssey or Iliad. Instead, Kauffmann emphasizes female grief and mourning. And again, following the 7 Years' War, there were many images in England and France of grieving widows, kind of analogies to the military situation. But Kauffmann's commitment to the kind of feminist position and a female perspective is consistent. So this was pleasing to aristocratic patrons who wanted to decorate their houses with Greco-Roman allusions to a heroic age, but without, kind of intense contemporary tragedy. So making a contemporary allusion, but through something classical. And women tend to occupy the central place in Kauffmann's work, if not always the kind of visual center, like Hector does at left. In Venus showing Aeneas and Achates the way to Carthage, Kauffmann relegates the two male protagonists to the far left and in a kind of shadowy profile, while Venus, the goddess, is brightly illuminated, totally in command of the pictorial field. Generally, Kauffmann's male figures resemble Hector and appear weaker than female figures with kind of boyish faces and demeanors. So these aren't kind of strapping, muscular men. We'll discuss that a bit more in a minute. Kauffmann veiled her classical women and never painted entirely nude people except for children, which in these scenes, which would decorate both the walls of the Royal Academy, but also the homes that she made these decorative designs for. So in her hands, she has these effeminate males and graceful women, fitting the pattern of the pioneer neoclassicists and underscoring their decorative functions. So she had much more demand as an interior designer, as we discussed. And so these sort of graceful, elegant forms really fit in. So what about those nude bodies? Well, we have to talk about this in the context of Kauffmann painting in this genre of history painting. These multi-figure, large-scale canvases that would tell stories from history and mythology. In the 18th century, the convention was to have central heroic figures from history painting to be a nude male, in the tradition of Winkelmann, and, heroic male bodies were often the center of these classical tales, and they would be also the compositional, the focus of neoclassical artworks as well. But in Kauffmann's hands, it's a bit different. So what bodies, what genders were shown as being central and important and heroic was different in Kauffmann's hands. Something I will draw out by showing you another one of her history paintings in comparison with another neoclassical history painting that you see at right by Jacques-Louis David, the kind of master of French neoclassicism. And you can see by the dates that these are two contemporaneous paintings. They're painting around the same time, and but they look very different, right? The story that Kauffmann painted at left is that of Cornelia, an ancient Roman woman who, according to the story, was the mother of the future Roman political leaders Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. So the brothers Gracchi were politicians in the 2nd century BCE in Rome. They were famous for seeking social reform, as being kind of populists, friends to the average Roman citizen. So, the kind of Bernie Sanders of their day, very popular. But where did these benefactors of the people learn their ethical systems? They learned it from their mother Cornelia, as we see here. So in this painting, a visitor has come to Cornelia's home to show off a wonderful array of jewelry and precious gems, sort of in her lap, the woman at right, what you might call treasures. And when she asks Cornelia to reveal her treasures, to kind of compare jewelry, what are your treasures, Cornelia? Cornelia humbly brings her children forward instead of running to her own jewelry box. So the message of this story is pretty clear. The most precious treasures of any woman are not material possessions, but the children who are the future. You can almost feel the embarrassment when you look at the face of this visitor at right, who Kauffmann has smartly painted with a furrowed brow and kind of gaping mouth. David's painting is drawn again from a narrative from Roman antiquity, from stories by Livy and Plutarch, and this is a very dramatic story, a story of Roman triplets, the Horatii triplets, who you see at left, who are about to go fight another group of triplets, very dramatic, despite the kind of familial conflict of intermarriage. So some of their sisters have married some of the Curatii triplets. You see the women at right very distressed about this upcoming conflict. And we're looking here at a moment that is actually David's invention, a moment of oath-taking to the father. This isn't in the texts, but David thought it would sort of read quite dramatically visually. And you can see why, right? There's this really clear legibility of intention, right? These arms outstretched, this act of oath-taking is quite clear to a viewer who would have seen it, right, stacked up on the walls as we saw at the Royal Academy. So there's this clear narrative David paints of loyalty and sacrifice, right? The swords here stand in for patriotism and action. And the two genders aren't integrated as they are in Kauffmann's painting. Instead, right, the women are relegated to the right third of the painting, as divided by these architectural arches in the background. So there's almost a kind of literal division here. And the women are also divided, right, by their bodily positions. They're kind of slumped over, they're, weeping. Some of them look almost unconscious here. So really they're just there to stand in for the cost of noble political sacrifice, right? They're just reacting. They're not the actors in the scene as the men are, or as Cornelia is in Kauffmann's painting. So in both of these neoclassical history paintings, you see two artists that are educated, right? Knowledgeable about classical texts and painting for audiences who are knowledgeable as well, right? Who know who Cornelia is, for instance, or who the Horatii triplets are. In both paintings, you see artists paint in this neoclassical style. The figures are in Greco-Roman dress. The settings, the kind of architectural settings, clearly kind of date these to the classical world. But also, and this is in contrast to Reynolds or Gainsborough, who we saw, you have this clarity of line, right? We don't see brushstrokes. We don't see visible brushstrokes typically in neoclassical painting. This kind of severity of line and even these sort of geometries that organize these paintings. This is part of the kind of moral clarity of neoclassicism here. The difference is, right, in Kauffmann's painting, women really have a role in social progress and in ancient history, right? Women help craft the kind of public virtues that we value in the ancient world, even if that's kind of building those values in a domestic setting. But in David's painting, and in his mind, the only role of women is to mourn, right, is to react to historical or political events, to tell us, right, about the kind of feelings associated with them. They're not heroic actors. And here this brings us back to the male nude. These are all students of David, so you have a lot of French names here. I know we're departing from Britain a little bit here, but neoclassicism was this sort of European movement. And in neoclassicism, the male nude was the key term in narrative history painting, but also in artistic training. And in fact, your academic success, your success as an artist at a place like the Royal Academy relied on the skilled construction of the specifically male anatomy, okay? So the skill at rendering the human form was assessed. You had to create something called the Académie. This is in French, so it's lowercase, and it ends in IE, the Académie, in order to kind of prove your worth, prove your readiness for public exhibition. So we're seeing 3 academies here by Davidian students. And in order to know how to create the kind of anatomical realism, artists had to begin with copying old master paintings, and sculptures. So you would, go and draw from ancient sculptures or plaster casts of ancient sculptures that had come out of the ground. And you would eventually work your way up to drawing and painting from live models. And you can imagine, right, especially looking at these academies, that women were excluded from that last and critical step. So even Angelica Kauffmann, who joined the Royal Academy, who was financially successful, painting history paintings, right, addressing these classical subjects, she was not allowed to study from live male models. This is Johann Zoffany's Royal Academicians at a Life class from 1771. This is a painting that shows you a lot of the artists and actors in the kind of elite level of art making in the 1770s. And what are they doing? They are grouped around 2 nude models who you see at the right hand side of your painting. One is seated in the right foreground, and one is lifting his arm or having his arm posed. So these are portraits. Zoffany has made portraits of real artists. So he distinguishes them all. They're dressed a little differently. Their faces look quite specific and different. And as they're, in this life model class, and you can see that the room has these shelves behind them with plaster reliefs and classical busts and sculptures, again, for those kind of first levels of artistic training. But where are the women? Well, you can see Kauffmann and maybe Mary Moser represented not in class, but they're represented on the right hand side of the painting as portraits on a wall. So this is Zoffany's way of presenting them in proxy. So he wants to include them in the group of important working artists in the 1770s, but he could not show them in this life drawing class because they were excluded. And why were they excluded? Because there were nude men there. And 18th century morals prohibited, right, women being in contact with nude male models, even for artistic training here. So this pastiche of the most famous intellectual groups at this moment, women are specifically excluded from the scene. I should say that Zoffany's group portrait is conceived as a pastiche directly referencing the most famous intellectual conversation in art, Raphael's School of Athens, which I show you here, which is a fresco painted for the Vatican, where Sir Joshua Reynolds, who I've pointed out in the last image, plays the part of Plato. So, notably absent from this famous portrait of the major thinkers in the Western tradition, and Raphael, right, conceived this. There's Michelangelo, there's Plato and Aristotle. So he's not paying attention. He doesn't care about geography or historical proximity, right? He's drawing from figures throughout the centuries in this kind of ideal conversation between intellectuals in this scene. But who's excluded? Who is not present, right? Women, of course. And so too, right, Zoffany takes up that tradition. even there's even in Zoffany's portrait, which you can flip back to next, a figure with no official connection to the Royal Academy, a Chinese artist who's fifth from the left in the previous slide, who just happened to be in London at the time. So you can really see the exaggeration of the exclusion of women in Zoffany's portrait of this life drawing class. When Kauffmann did paint academic bodies, so these classical bodies that show musculature and anatomy, right? Even in the calves and arms, that's a really hard thing to do, and it takes study. So when Kauffmann did paint bodies in these history paintings, there was always this really sort of strange discussion about the artist's erotic relationship with the model, if they were male, right? Oh, does she know how to paint a male calf because she's seen a lot of nude male legs, right? This was said actually by critics at the time. And she couldn't just paint women's bodies because there was this supposition that she was perhaps, these were all self-portraits, right, of her own nude body. So she sort of lost either way when she was painting these figures in history paintings. So one argument was that Kauffmann's sort of more effeminate male bodies were a result of her elevating women, right? Of her making, sort of challenging the values of these muscular male nudes that we see in Davidian paintings or in Winkelmann's texts. There's also the fact that sometimes these bodies are wrong, that she gets anatomy wrong. So here you're seeing Kauffmann's Pliny and his mother at the eruption of Vesuvius. And you can see, right, Mount Vesuvius erupting in the background if you follow the figure at right's arm to the left side of the painting. This was a large-scale history painting exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1786. So a very important canvas. But the figure, Pliny the Younger, the figure in blue, the sort of adolescent in blue, who witnessed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, if you look carefully, he has two left feet, right? Quite literally. And so this is a big anatomical mistake that Kauffmann made for this very important commission. Well, because she wasn't allowed to study the form, right? The human figure with live models. So that's a problem. So one reason for these kind of effeminate male bodies was that she was, elevating women in her history paintings. But the second answer is that she could actually be accused of impropriety for studying anatomy. So if she demonstrated too much skill representing male anatomy, she could be seen as like lascivious, right? As doing something improper. So these accusations of the effeminacy of her male figures suggests both, right? Both artistic failure, calling attention to her own unfortunate and or scandalous reputations with men as well. So either her virtue is guarded to the exclusion of her learning real artistic skills she needs, and also at the same time, there were fears about her sexual appetite that came across whenever she painted male bodies. There were rumors that she would sneak into the life drawing classes dressed up as a man. There were assurances from her biographer that she only studied the unclothed arms or legs of a model under the supervision of her father, right? How dare she see a leg, right, without a male chaperone? So her role in this all-male world was deeply destabilizing and problematic for her career. Before you see a very strange painting, I'll admit. by the artist Nathaniel Hone. This is The Conjurer from 1775. And I should say that this is a satirical painting. That's one reason why it looks so strange. So what's happening in this bizarre painting? Well, here we have a bearded conjurer pointing his wand towards a fire, which you see in the left bottom corner of this canvas. And the fire is kindled by an assortment of old master prints from which a framed oil painting emerges. You can see at the top left. Hone's painting was recognized as a satirical attack on Joshua Reynolds, specifically, and Reynolds' tendency to borrow motifs from well-known works of art, right? The Apollo Belvedere, the Medici Venus. We've discussed Reynolds' borrowing of these arrangements and compositions before. So Sir Joshua Reynolds is the conjurer, and leaning across his knee, arms folded, is a young smiling girl. In the background, at the extreme top left, there's a group of naked figures cavorting in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, waving palettes and paintbrushes before them. And the women in that painting are wearing black stockings. Now, Kauffmann was so offended by this that she submitted a written objection to have it removed from public view. And the figure was revised to kind of negotiate this. So why was she offended? Well, it was suggested that Kauffmann wrote her complaint to defend Reynolds, and that the young girl was meant to be Kauffmann, right? Another founding member of the Academy and allegedly a former lover of Reynolds. However, it was not the representation of Kauffmann being this kind of simpering student at Reynolds' knee which apparently offended her, so much as the inclusion of a naked woman, presumably her, among the group of nudes cavorting around St. Paul's Cathedral on the top left. Kauffmann was included in the planning of the project to decorate the interior of St. Paul's Cathedral, along with Reynolds himself and a few important contemporary artists of their day, and including also her former fiancé, Nathaniel Dance. So Kauffmann's reputation is doubly on the line here in this mean satirical painting. She's shown both as a simpering young innocent being seduced on the lap of the older male artist, but she's also shown as a kind of hedonist libertine dancing naked in front of a cathedral. So this is really, I show you this bizarro painting to show you the double-edged and contradictory nature of Kauffmann's exclusion again, right? She's either too naive, right, untrained, painting two left feet, but she's also at the same time, right, accused of being overly sexual, right, as having too many lovers, of being too familiar with the male body. So this is really a kind of the contradictory place of a woman artist at this moment. And here we have another image of Kauffmann by another satirical image of Kauffmann, in this case by Nathaniel Dance, right, her former fiance. Another mean painting, or portrait I should say, from 1767, next to the painting of Sir Joshua Reynolds, right, his own self-portrait that we saw in 1780. So on the one hand, we see two images of artists studying traditional sculpture in order to showing their kind of erudition as artists and their kind of training and association with art of the past. But what problems might you begin to see with Kauffmann's former fiance depicting her like this? He shows her absorbed in learning, right? Her writing implement is on the desk. She's shown having completed a sketch based on what looks like a classical torso here with exaggerated musculature. But this is a joke, right? This is a joke on Angelica. And the joke is around, right, the buttocks of that classical sculpture, right? That's what she's looking at. Her attention is focused on this man's behind. So this undermines the image of a woman as a serious artist, that she's, right, somehow distracted by her desire for this sculpture. It also shows her lack of training, that she's still, right, drawing from plaster casts and not the live model, right? She's not in Zoffany's class, right? She's not in Zoffany's portrait, but instead she's here, right, by herself studying from plaster. And a sort of, to add insult upon insult, Dance shows her sketch that she's produced in front of us as not being very good, right? Not having the kind of anatomical detail, the kind of proliferation of muscles, and to my eyes, right, too many muscles on this satirical sculpture. She's missing a lot of information in her sketch, so she's not even a good artist. So you read about Kauffmann's really savvy self-branding, her achievements as an entrepreneur and an artist, even in the confines with the restrictions of 18th century institutions on the career paths of women. But it wasn't right, as much as she managed her reputation and established this incredible career. This career continued to be undermined again and again by male artists who were challenged by her success and by the cultural standards of her moment.